So this is another OpenChain meeting. This is the AI study group. We are here today on a Europe-Asia call, and the purpose of this call is to give everyone a chance to engage regardless of time zone. There was a big workshop about a week ago, and I believe Matthew will be recapping that workshop on this call. But first, our traditional and much loved antitrust policy notice. Everyone is probably familiar with this slide. If not, it will become your good friend. We show it at the beginning of every meeting. The full Linux Foundation antitrust policy can be found on the website. And if you're from a member company, you can ask questions of our counsel, Andy Updegrove. Right. Well, I guess I should hand over to our co-chair, Matthew, and let him take the stage.
Thanks, Shane, and feel free to drop off if it's getting too late. So, as Shane said, that we had a workshop just over a week ago. Dave Marr chaired this workshop. I see Alice and Haley were also on this workshop. We had 3 hours to go through a couple of topics. One on AI model supply chain issues, which Brian talked about, one on dataset supply chain issues. And then we spent, I don't know, the best part of an hour and a half talking about what the next steps are in this sort of open chain environment, what we wanted to try and get out of this. If you recall from previous conversations that we've had, we wanted to get a group of principles that we could share amongst this community and agree that we would work on different areas and agree to these different principles, and it could in time build up to become something that OpenChain could adopt and possibly make it into a specification or standard. So as I said, Brian and Jeff, they are experts in AI models, from Brian from a legal background and Jeff from a data set background. I have their slides here. We can share them around. Shane, have you already shared these slides around and the recording? I can't recall.
No recording or slides at this juncture.
No record.
I was asked
Okay.
not to share the recording. Participants wanted to run the event under Chatham House.
That was it.
So this is going to be our first chance to go through the details of the slides. And naturally, that does mean the conversation will remain confidential. So we'll have the recap today.
Great. So Alice, Haley, feel free to chip in from what I recall. But we started the conversation talking about models. If you recall, David created a slide highlighting different interactions that we can have with AI, from a user stance, from somebody using it, someone creating a model, and then the model itself. We touched on different jurisdictions having different requirements for the use of these models. The EU AI Act, the NIST framework, China's latest legislation, and clearly others. Some of these legislations are in their infancy. Some of them are more established, and some still yet to be ratified, but kind of working towards this. We then kind of sidetracked a little bit and spoke on something that I'm a strong believer in, that I'm all for government regulations, but we have an advantage here at OpenChain being jurisdictional agnostic, where we could set principles and define what we would like as the industry, and then work with these jurisdiction regulators to see if they could adopt some of their standards. So some of our thoughts. We touched on open source versus proprietary in models, and we spoke quite a bit about what do we want this to cover, this open chain principles. Is it just an open source model, or do we want to talk about proprietary models as well. And I think we spent at least half an hour debating this, having advantages and disadvantages for both. Open source clearly wanting to be more transparent and providing data sets, whereas proprietary models being less transparent. And whether we wanted to include it or not, we kind of put a pin in it in the end. And I'd be keen to hear what people on this call think, that should we just focus our attention to agreeing principles on the creation and the usage of open source models, or on proprietary as well. So I will just pause there to see if anyone has any thoughts on that.
I just wanted to jump in. Now, I wasn't in the workshop. I just opened it and then I went because it was during the middle of the night here in Japan. Um, and that means I'm coming to this cold. I'm coming to it with fresh eyes, like many of our audience. I just wanted to ask, maybe there was something in AI that's illustrating attention in the market, and I wonder if other people felt the same, which is where open source and proprietary in AI are very much becoming a spectrum. With, for example, Meta's Llama 2 license being kind of open source, but it's got this condition where when you hit 700 million users, you're in a commercial negotiation. And this seems to suggest that in AI, perhaps even more than in other jurisdictions, we'll have this spectrum between open source as we know it, proprietary as we know it, and then maybe a lot more stuff in the middle too. I was just wondering if anyone else brought that up.
I don't think we did actually, Shane, but it does bring another level to this conversation.
I was going to say that's something we're struggling with, Matthew, isn't it? Internally, when we're talking about releasing models and what because we've got obviously processes for dealing with open source, and we've had this kind of conversation around whether or not what an open source AI model license looks like, and whether it should fall within that kind of open process, or if it's proprietary, and kind of what we're struggling with that as well.
Haley, Alice, and others who were on that call, the conversation also led to, for one side of the argument, let's define some rules for either type of tool, and just let's see what happens. And if we need to carve out exceptions for one or the other, then let's do that. But yeah, we spent some time going back and forth about the benefits of including proprietary or open source in what we want to try and get out of it. But as Haley mentions, yes, it does cause sort of lots of questions on how we're releasing these models.
Just a follow-on thought, which is related to this. It's a pretty clear delineation between, let's say, open source, proprietary, and then people experimenting with open-ish licenses and causing tension. But interestingly, in AI, of course, code is involved, but data is involved. Then there's outputs coming out of these things. There is, I suppose, arguably something that open AI is not open source AI. Maybe some code will be, but then there's all these other things which may be open in a different way to software because it's not software. That's just a side note again, but it is related to this idea that maybe the spectrum will be slightly different, and it won't be necessarily inherently anchored to open source because it's not inherently anchored to software.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that is something we touched on as well, isn't it? I think in the workshop.
It is.
Yeah.
Hence going back and forth and then not really coming to any form of conclusion, apart from let's carry on and push this conversation further down the line to see whether we can come up with principles, and if we need to carve things out for something that's open source, proprietary, etc.
I suppose a side note might be that if we're looking at AI compliance, maybe we can say that the conversation about what is open enough for the industries or open enough for my company, it is a valid conversation. But if we're concerned about AI compliance, maybe the openness of it matters less than the management of it, which I know would be a slightly different optic to, for instance, how we've approached software. But it might be an interesting optic to avoid us going in normative circles around the question of what's open in such a fast-moving area, but rather to have a way to determine through processes what's tolerable and manageable for my company. How do I manage compliance here so I can get a red flag if things are going sideways for me?
And just building on that point, Shane, you can see there's bullet points on the rest of this slide. These were the other areas we touched on for models, and we kind of said we wouldn't be so prescriptive in any conclusions that for, I don't know, transparency, you need to declare all the training material and all the license and supply everything. We were going to touch on the fact that you should supply the level of transparency that is appropriate for the use case and your company. And then if a company adopts that, then they have their own internal categories that can then raise those red flags internally, but externally, as an open chain principle agreement, we wouldn't go down to that granular level. Just building on this model, and we don't have a point here. This slide is actually reproduced later on because we realized as part of the next steps of works, we were going to start fleshing these bullet points out. But we had some other questions and queries around with models, the origin of the model, where it was created, where it's maybe necessarily run, because there was energy efficiency thoughts that we wanted to bring in. And then from a technical aspect, can the model tell us a bit about itself and how it was created? So these were two additional points that we touched on when discussing things around models that we wanted to try and capture and cover. But as you can see down the list here, use restrictions. So you can use my model, but as Shane mentioned, if you're going to get more than 700 million users, then 700,000 users, you need to start negotiating, or you can't use this for military purposes or other restrictions. So again, we touched on, we wouldn't define that per se, but we would create a point there that you should be thinking about that. Testing, again, what was the model tested on, how it was tested. Again, not stating how you did that, but saying that these are the things that you should consider when creating the module. Who is accountable for it? Is that you? Are you giving all liabilities away? Or is it a third party? The data sets, and we kind of expanded on data sets and I'll go on to that in another minute. But again, what was the data set? What licenses were under? Things to consider. And then we also touched on the security of it, in line with the other security standard that OpenChain has created. Are there any vulnerabilities associated with it? So I am just going to skip down the slides to the end here. This was the slide. So you'll see on this slide here, a lot of the bullet points were the same. This is what the conclusion of the model section was all about. And we thought these were the bullet points that we would possibly consider when considering an LLM. So you can see a lot of the points there I've raised. So what information is needed for the models, how it was trained, who made it, where. We touched on open source proprietary, use restrictions, transparency, bias testing, accountability, the data set, security, the origin, that touches on the where. An AI bomb, it needs to be sufficient to deal with complying with regulations in any jurisdiction. So again, we said you probably need an AI bomb. Here are some suggestions, but not specifically saying what is required in that. Liability, technical information on how the model works, the ability for a model to explain itself. I've got the wonderful OpenChain logo just hiding behind the next bit. Yes, so that was the conclusion, and then we said we would focus on a couple of use cases, and we touched on this Hugging Face example. Hayley, would you mind? I know you've looked at this Hugging Face in a bit more detail. Are you able just to talk to that point a little bit, because I can't recall what was discussed.
Yeah, we were talking about kind of its provenance data, isn't it? And how if we had like a standard model card, and I think it overlaps with the work being done by, is it SPDX that you've been involved in? So yeah, so kind of the model card, I was having a look at it earlier, sort of lists out, you know, it describes the model, you know, what license is needed, what, and I'll share, I could share my screen if you want.
Yeah, sure, go
I've got
ahead.
that link, I've got that link open. Okay, I think you need to stop sharing because I can't share while you're participating.
You're not a host. I think do I need to
Okay,
make you a
fine.
host?
Ah,
No, I can't make you a host because I'm not a host. Shane,
oh,
are you?
The
Failing that,
host
I'll just
system
open the
is
link.
down now, but Haley should be able to share now that
ah,
your screen is not sharing.
oh yes, of
I
course,
have
yeah,
opened it if you want me to, Hayley. Have you got it? There
so
you go.
I probably would have been quicker to send you the link, wouldn't it? But yeah, so yeah, this is the kind of example code. So these are kind of the headings that it goes into the detail of. And we're just kind of, I guess, making sure these headings are kind of relate to what those issues you've just raised in that list, which I think most of them do. So things like bias, risk, and limitations. So kind of declaring anything you're aware of in terms of the training data. There's a whole section on training data here about, you know, provenance and where it's come from. So yeah, so kind of us, I guess, coming up with a kind of standard way that, you know, if you're releasing a model, then you record that information in a standard, easy to digest, easy to read, easy to understand way that helps you kind of analyze your risks and kind of feel safe in that kind of publishing and use. Is that helpful?
It was for me. Thanks for running through that. It does touch on the fact that other people are thinking about this and adopting similar standards. I think is
Yeah, I think
beneficial.
Google have got their own version as well. I think they're kind of trying to put out a kind of standard model card
Yeah.
examples, but I think the consensus around engineering definitely is that this Hugging Face model card is a lot, it's more kind of data focused and easier to read.
Any points on Hugging Face or having maybe more standardized versions of a model card?
Just a note that I think this came up on export control call a couple of days ago. Helio was just pointing out on export control, a lot of people are talking about this topic and working adjacent. So in SPDX, they're making export control support in a services profile. OpenChain has an export control study group. And while there isn't perfect overlap, there is some, and that could be wasted, time where we could consolidate. And it just occurs to me that when it comes to something like a model card, that we don't want to have a bunch of us defining slightly different but ultimately same purpose stuff. So it does seem to make sense to try to coalesce around a pre-existing approach like the Hugging Face one, and where it's deemed insufficient or improvable to provide that feedback to them and to just centralize there. And unless there was something drastic that required a fork, not to create overlapping material.
So I'm in agreement with what Shane says there. Let's not recreate the wheel. If we already have something that's a basis of it, then let's utilize that. If people are enjoying using this one, let's coalesce towards that. It might be,
It
as
looks
we've
quite,
always said, with
sorry, I was going to say it looks quite comprehensive because it's got the environmental impact piece there that we talked about as well. Sorry.
And I suppose, we can reach out to LFAI and Data, see what they're up to with model cards and so on. Uh, and just check out if there's something else that we've missed here. But hypothetically, using someone else's work, let's say Hugging Face, can be useful because it can draw them into our conversation as well. More contributors and more alignment.
Shall I stop sharing and then you can carry on, Matthew?
sure. I just want to touch on two other points. I've just got my notes up here around transparency. One argument that was discussed, and I think it's part of the EU AI Act, is if something's considered a trade secret, then you can circumvent several sort of requirements. But there's a debate here of, should companies use trade secrets as an exception in AI modeling with, say, the structural design? Can they get away with saying that that is a trade secret and therefore not have to oblige by any obligations? Sandra from ARM highlighted that the data set's clearly defined as something that cannot be classed as a trade secret, but the model and the secret source of that structural design could be. Okay, the next topic I would touch on was around transparency. We touched on audits, and I can't recall how audit kind of came up, but do we think there should be audit rights in any agreement to have a look at the data set? Again, I'm of the stance that if we're building trust in the ecosystem, if I sign up to a principle to say that my model is trained on something that has, good licensing, good ethics, good bias management, a mitigation plan, then I shouldn't have to see that. I just trust that this other company has met those obligations. But should we consider having audit rights to verify that people are doing that? Do central governments have the rights to do audits? Do private companies have the rights to do audits? What are people's thoughts on having the ability to do audits in sort of models and training sets?
It strikes me that that's fundamentally a contractual issue, apart from government regulation. So it would really be a case of leverage and legal requirements facing companies in a negotiation with a provider. So I guess I'd say that having the ability to audit what's going on sounds reasonable and rational, but it's not necessarily something that a third party can define on behalf of an inter-party contractual relationship.
Agreed. We next moved into just a few stories that people had noted, and Brian, who was presenting this time, picked up on the ML Commons Safety Testing Consortium. Is
Sorry to
anyone on this
interject,
board?
Matthew. Do you have a slide on that? Just because there's no slide sharing at the moment.
I can share my screen again.
That
The
would be
reason there's no
fantastic.
slide showing is I'm also looking at my notes.
Oh, right. Okay.
Let's
So
see
maybe there's no
what I can
slide on
do.
that. Oh,
The
God.
slide was simple. Oops, they're the wrong ones. There's merely a bullet point here. So the ML Commons safety testing story that was touched on, and we've touched on that, Hugging Face and to a lesser extent Google Gemini. This is a consortium of people doing safety testing in in sort of models, where they're coming up with a list of questions to challenge a model. And they are inappropriate questions that a model should not be able to answer. We didn't touch on what those questions were, but I can infer things like, how do you make a bomb? I don't know, this is purely a speculation of whether that question is there, but these are the sort of questions that a model should say, I'm not prepared to give you an answer to that for hopefully obvious reasons. In some jurisdictions, they are being quite open with these questions. And then we also touched on other jurisdictions that you can send your model to the regulator, and they will test it themselves against their own set of questions, and will let you know if it passes or failed. So we merely just touched on this as a war story of things that are happening. I do like that concept to have some form of verification that we have this safety principle, and it could be something we also consider here, that have you checked your model against inappropriate questions? It could be kind of left at that level. Any other comments on that?
I don't have one on that specific thing. I just wanted to flag something that came up sideways as this was unfolding. Yari just pointed out a CO2 thing on Hugging Face, a model card related to CO2 emissions, and I just replied, and it may be relevant in terms of scoping. I just replied that it has merit to consider CO2, but it does perhaps sound more like an ESG strategy issue rather than AI compliance per se. And what I mean by that is that there's
Sorry,
so many
Shane, what's ESG?
Ethical and social guidelines.
Thank you.
So a lot of companies are cynical side for the purpose of having a label for stock market, or less cynical side for the purpose of consolidating all, green and socially positive approaches. A lot of companies have an ESG strategy and milestones and KPIs. And something like carbon emissions seems to be an ESG type thing, as opposed to something, let's say, compliance, which is, will I get sued today? And I guess that's my note there would be, there's so many options of what we can cover on something like AI compliance. If we start including manage all of AI, as opposed to saying, how do I not get sued? How do I not get hit by a massive regulatory fine? Maybe we can start with the very fundamental corporate survival or corporate cost, rather than trying to cover the full scope of what a model card might bring up, like this. This is just a suggestion, but it would be somewhat aligned with how we've approached things before. Catch the largest fire from a corporate perspective, and then let the rest unfold adjacent or elsewhere.
I mean, if we want to just expand on that, going back to the workshop, we did talk about if a model is being run in Norway, which is full of hydroelectricity, the carbon footprint is probably lower than if it was in a country that's mainly based on petroleum. I agree with you, Shane, that is this a compliance issue? I don't think so. And if we're wanting to focus on AI compliance, it's probably a nice to have, but not going to be relevant. However, from an ethical standpoint, if we do want to include that, I can see some value in it, because we're all hopefully wanting to reduce our carbon footprint. And if we see two models that can do the same thing, and one of them's run on hydroelectric and one of them's run on petroleum, then I would probably choose the one that's run on hydroelectric.
To that point, one way we've sort of dealt with this to guide people into thinking about something without getting down into the weeds about it previously was to ask people to have a policy position on something. And a good example was previously on open source contribution. There was a lot of kind of normative stuff there. Most companies are takers. They're free riders in terms of they get the code for free, which is a purpose of the licensing. But they don't contribute to it. And some parties have a strong opinion that if you obtain value, you should contribute back value. And some parties have a strong opinion that that's not the letter of the license. No, thank you. So um, rather than taking a strong position on this, perhaps we can guide people into having to do their own consideration about it. And for instance, have a suggestion or strong suggestion that people have a policy that includes ... and that could be one of those dots could be, alignment with environmental alignment with the company's environmental strategy, or alignment with the company's, ethical and social guideline strategy. Have some bullet points there so people can look at it and think, well, I should check that out. What is our strategy here? Or they could think, gosh, we don't have one. So what should I do here? And trigger that conversation without having to go too far into pre-chewing it for them.
Agreed, and that's a very good and valid point, Shane. Just making a note. There was a message in the chat about the workshop and the slides. These are the slides that were presented at that workshop that we are going through, and hopefully Shane can share them around afterwards. Moving on, we touched on data sets. Jeff kind of brought this point up. Data sets to me is sort of more traditional open source licensing type principles, in my opinion, where, as you can see here, we've got third-party data set usage. Some of the data sets that we're seeing explicitly say you can use this for research only, testing, training, benchmarking models only, or product development and distribution. And each of those use cases will be, I guess, different to what your company is trying to achieve, whether you're just a research organization or whether you are developing and distributing a proprietary model. The data sets that you use may be restricted based on what you're using the model for. There's also the concept of a company creating its own data set, and whether that's for just internal use to train your own models or a third-party model, or whether you're distributing it for others to consider. So yeah, bringing out use cases here in the principles was something we touched on again, that I don't think this is going to be as straightforward as some of the other standards that we have worked on, because I think there will be many exceptions and use cases here. So at a very high level, we would say data sets need to oblige by the license terms of the sort of use that you want. Whether we want to go more granular is something that I guess we traditionally haven't done in OpenChain. And then issues with data sets, a whole host of things from copyright, privacy, export control concerns that I think are sort of less touched on in more traditional licensing, because here we've got a data set in one country, a model in a different country, the user in a third country, and there are consequences there for different jurisdictions having different license terms in terms of fair use in the US, and that depends on where the person, the model, the data set is. In Europe, that fair use concept isn't really there. So export control restrictions also needed to be considered, as well as accuracy and sort of safety and any inappropriate images in these data sets. I think I've touched on these points here. So, you know, for good practice and good sort of data sets, we would consider a whole host of points here. So we've done an appropriate legal review from its licensing terms, from its export controls terms, where it's stored, if we have the rights to, if there's any geographical or time restrictions on how it's stored, are there any audit requirements, any record keeping requirements, or any security concerns? Again, very similar to traditional open source software compliance. Do we have trust in the data set? Is it accurate in what it is saying it is doing? Who is accountable for that data set? Is it the IP owner, or are those rights then distributed to the model owner who is using it? And yes, compliance can be different in different use cases with different stakeholders. We've touched on some of these points in the model section as well. So open source versus proprietary data sets, the same argument can happen with open source versus proprietary models. Do we want to just consider open source data sets? Do we want to also include proprietary data sets? The licenses for proprietary data sets that I've been seeing are getting more and more complex. And so when we're defining principles of what a good data set would be and to build trust between you and I, do we want to only include open source or open data sets, or do we include proprietary ones in there as well? And yes, then we opened it up to discussion. We talked about different data sets and different licensing terms. I know folks at ARM kind of chipped in here about things that we had seen. Dave from Qualcomm and others had touched on other licensing terms of data sets. And then we opened it up to a round table, this workshop. So I'll just pause here. Does anyone have any other points they want to add of things we should consider when considering data sets?
One thing that comes to mind is that arguably right now we're in the wild west of data sets where people just scraped random pieces off the internet. And that's triggered two things. One is that the LLMs are producing an awful lot of garbage because, of course, these things aren't intelligent at all. They don't think, they don't know anything because they're just a predictive analysis of the next word in sequence. So if you feed them 170 billion data points, but a lot of that is Reddit and random blogs, their guesses will often produce garbage. And we're seeing that in action where something very factual, like, what's the rotational speed of the Earth? They respond quite well. There's a lot of data points that have that, and most people don't have a reason to fabricate different speeds of Earth rotation. But if there's something more vague, you've no idea what the LLM will throw out. And that kind of, I think suggests an immaturity in the market where scraping random stuff isn't necessarily a good idea. The point is to get enough data to allow the LLM to function, but there are consequences. The second thing that comes to mind is that people with high quality data are beginning to say no. New York Times is not happy with OpenAI. And this suggests that we have the potential then for data to be gatekept and potentially data sets to have interesting new terms. Maybe you're going to look at a situation where gaining access to the data sets of the model that you want to use may become a much more complex choice. The smaller, compact, slightly less functional, but more accurate data set, the larger accurate data set, but requiring multiple license payments to other parties, or the large data set that may include clown car responses. So just a note there that these these things, I don't think we've had a strong conversation on the compliance side about contextualizing where this is going because it's still unfolding. We're not sure. But it might be something we need to have because if we adopt a data set today because we're adopting a model today, we're not sure where that data set will go tomorrow. Will it be swapped out? Will we have fragmented options? Will we suddenly have a new restriction? Hypothetically, if a news website suddenly said you can't have any of our data unless you pay this royalty fee, suddenly our provider says you can continue to access our LLM, but there's this plus fee, uh, can't be helped. And I don't think that stuff is in the compliance discussion today, but it probably should for a read ahead. Certainly, if a company went all in on OpenAI today, it's not like they can pivot their corporate processes in January of next year just because suddenly there's new fees. They have to think ahead.
Maybe I should, no, or Jari here. Just came in my mind what Shane said. I think like everybody is already aware of that, but the fact that if the, let's say, quality data or quality data sets, are taken out from the equation, then somebody starts to use bad data, which then generates, again, more LLM models, more text, which then gets fed back to the system, and we are getting to the vicious circle there.
Yeah. Which just seems to suggest that on data sets we probably need when we look at it to think, what's the data set license and have something in our mind today. And what are the terms that I'll obtain this data on, which is also a read ahead. I'm going to sign a contract with OpenAI, but I'm going to lock in access to whatever their full and curated data set is for 3 years as my baseline as I go into this contract. And I'm not sure companies are thinking of that now. Maybe they're just thinking, okay, I'll negotiate the seat pricing and I'll get ChatGPT 4 and all good.
Alice has raised her hand. Alice?
Hey, and I'm thinking, listening to what you're all saying, and I'm thinking, given that a lot of these data sets won't necessarily be open source and won't necessarily have a license that's picked from a rack of open source licenses, and everyone's going to probably write their own license, I guess, at least for a while until it becomes relatively standardized. That's my assumption. It may just, I'm thinking, in order to sort of summarize for people who want an AI bomb, maybe possibly just be able to say that we want to know what the data set was and not so much say what the license was, and perhaps that would just give the right level of visibility to then be able to say, well, do I have a problem with that data set in terms of being able to see if it's changed, let's say. I think that's something that was mentioned a minute ago. Or perhaps some data sets will be able to see that who owns them, and that will help towards getting that transparency without, I don't know, I guess I'm just trying to think, like, how difficult is it to really unpack all the licensing if we are doing an AI bomb? Or maybe it's more about just first identifying what data sets they are. I don't know, maybe someone can help me like build on that a bit.
I suppose, that's a really good point. I suppose we're hitting on different aspects of where could this trip me up. One, as you pointed out, is the provenance question. Where's this from? Arguably then on the licensing question, it's not the license per se maybe that we need. We could describe it as the permissions. So we have the provenance, the permissions, and then perhaps the persistence. How long is this provenance information or permission information assured? And if you check the provenance and the permission and the persistence of it, you could discover this data is from here. The terms I'm seeing for usage are this. And the persistence of this, the length of time I have is X, let's say, assured until the end of the year. That's what I get if I take this data today. I get from here, this term until the end of the year, and then I have to double check again where we're going next year. Maybe that persistence, permission, and provenance, permission, and persistence might help solve our approach.
I could certainly see, if there is any change to the data set that's underlying things for the bill of materials, then that's something that could be alerted on potentially if it's part of a monitoring solution. Would be the other thing, rather than sort of giving a sort of guarantee from how long it's going to be relevant.
And I guess we have that we have an interesting challenge in the amount of information we want. Like, let's say we go down the provenance route. We have to be cautious, I think, from a lesson learned with open source, which was that military providers immediately say, "Who made this code? What? Tell me the nation states." I say, "Oh my gosh, you're suddenly asking me for 10,000 contributor histories. Can't do it." And just thinking of something like, I'm not sure, is it ChatGPT or Llama 2, which has 168 billion data points. That's going to be a big list. So I guess we also have to think, what's the way we can describe the provenance requirement without accidentally making it impossible to do so? That's more of a side note, but it indicates, I suppose, that we probably want as the Americans would say, the cliff notes on this, as opposed to the encyclopedia.
Yeah, it may not be possible to give that level of detail, and like you say, perhaps it's not within the remit of this kind of work. Otherwise, we might never do anything else.
Just in the last 10 minutes, I kind of wanted to touch on kind of how we wrapped up the workshop. You've seen this slide before. We kind of summarized all the points that we thought were going to be important around models. We've clearly added to the conversation today. Then we touched on the points that we thought were going to be needed around data sets. And again, we've built on that further today. But the next steps for progressing this, and we kind of highlighted that actually sitting down and starting writing things down in the workshop was quite fruitful, was let's look at one use case. We said, let's start at just an LLM, a text-to-text LLM, and work through that Hugging Face model card to see if there's any differences between the two. As we touched on before, we don't want to reinvent the wheel, and if we can coalesce on something that's already there, that's going to be helpful. And we highlighted the points that we saw on the previous two slides that we would like to aim to, and maybe build on that. And we want to then look at what that bare bones skeleton model card might look like for this use case, this text-to-text first use case. So these slides were shared. We'll share it again with this audience and the rest of the mailing list. But it's starting to think about what we want to try and write down. And these bullet points are probably good headings, and developing them is where we see the next stage, using this one use case. And if it seems fruitful with one use case, we'll then start expanding it with, say, other models or other data sets. And then we can start carving out things like that open source versus proprietary to see if we do need any exceptions. Does anyone have any comments on that before I move to the last bit? No. So what we were thinking about doing is we thought it was, again, as I said before, quite fruitful to have a bit of a longer couple of hours. I mean, we've had sort of 50 minutes now talking about this, and it's all been great discussions. And again, we did that in the workshop, but then in the subsequent hour, we started documenting and writing down our points in the session. So Dave Marr, who's the other co-chair for this study group, and in conjunction with Shane and Jimmy, the chair of OpenChain, we were looking at thinking of changing the cadence of these meetings to being probably monthly and having a 2-hour session, one here in this time zone and one in the US, Europe time zone. So we can carry on that conversation. We can update on the previous workshop if you've not been to the other time zone workshop, but then also start fleshing out the points in the second hour. What are people's thoughts on that?
My thought is that perhaps the optimal at this stage, given our current contributors, I see mostly North America and Europe. I think maybe the optimal would be to have that gravity acknowledged by having 1 2-hour workshop per month focused on that, and perhaps on the week after having a 1-hour call like this as a catch up for Asia to see what the North America and Europe did, people in Asia to look at it, and then to send in feedback for the next major workshop as needed. And the reason I suggest that is because on this time slot, we're going to have none of the US experts present for workshopping. And we currently don't seem to have a cluster of experts in Asia workshopping. So, I'd go having one workshop, that's the center of gravity, and then having an explicit Asia catch-up call, maybe a week after that, could allow us to address the audience we know we have today without losing any of them, while not excluding the audience we have today in Asia.
Sounds good. Got a thumbs up there. Okay, then. Well, I think the next session anyway is closed. Sorry, cancelled in 2 weeks' time anyway. So Shane and myself and Dave will look at the meeting cadence and send out updated meetings, probably to what Shane just described.
Yep. And Matthew, I've got an email in your inbox. Maybe you can have a quick look later today, actually on this topic. If you're aligned with that, then I can just communicate to the list and adjust our calendar invites. But in a nutshell, if we go with a workshop format for 2 hours, maybe we hold it first Tuesday around 7 a.m. Pacific, so it's not punishingly early for the Americans, afternoon Europe. And that's held on the first Tuesday of each month. And then maybe 1 week later, we have the Asia call to do the recap for Asia and to take any feedback from Asian participants to feed into the next workshop, which will happen the next month, first Tuesday, around 7 a.m. Pacific.
Sounds good. Well, if there's nothing else to discuss, I'm happy to close the call unless anyone has any final comments. No, thank you all for your time today. I'll propose closing the call, and we'll share these slides out and update the meeting cadence in due course. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.